This is World History of Christianity. We are in Chapter 6, Africa, Part 2, beginning on page 206. The Yoruba Christian returnees were concerned both to uphold and preserve their native society and to reform it. The translation of the scriptures into the vernacular was embarked upon by missionaries and Creole agents. From this literary work grew a desire to establish the validity and legitimacy of local culture, and to contribute to its delineation and preservation through writing down its history and traditions and customs. The motive was certainly not a nostalgic antiquarianism, but a concern for cultural integrity in societies undergoing profound transformations. One can cite the work of a Creole clergyman, the Rev. Samuel Johnson's History of the Yoruba. This kind of project was not simply the work of those who looked at their culture from one remove, which, of necessity, was the experience of those Creoles who had experienced radical displacement and reorientation. It can also be seen in the work of the Basil Mission on the Gold Coast, Ghana, in the great cultural enterprise among the Akan people undertaken by the German missionary Johannes Christaller and his local collaborator and colleague David Asante from Akrapong. Edward Wilmot Blyden, 1832 through 1912, was an important figure, both in the development of Creole self-consciousness and in the critique of Creole Christianity. A native of the West Indies, he spent much of his life in West Africa, in Liberia and Sierra Leone. He was a brilliant linguist, more independent in both intellectual outlook and lifestyle than those brought up in missionary institutions and relying on the mission for their livelihood could be. His book, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, 1887, brings together articles written over a number of years. One of his recurring themes is the potential of Christianity to speak from within the African condition, but he was critical of the somewhat artificial way in which this had developed within Creole Christianity, as compared with the organic process which he discerned in the slow development over many centuries of West African Islam. He urged the creation of a native African church, an attractive proposition to many of those involved in the native pastorate controversy within the CMS and Anglican circles in Sierra Leone in the 1870s and its aftermath. This controversy arose from a feeling that the church was dragging its feet in implementing the three selves policy of Henry Venn, the secretary of CMS. Venn argued that the missionary task was essentially pioneering. Its aim was to create a self-governing, self-financing, and self-propagating local church which would free the mission to pioneer new fields. The euthanasia of the mission. In Sierra Leone, this met with local missionary opposition, a combination of a hard-headed realism from the Europeans on the spot in the face of armchair theorizing, doubts about the actual level of financial self-sufficiency obtainable in the local church, and a tendency to despise or minimize the Creole achievement. An articulate young priest called James Johnson, 1840 through 1917, was the spokesman of the Creole Christian community in Sierra Leone, especially during the native pastorate controversy of 1871 through 74. He antagonized Bishop Cheatham by the force of his protests against the racial discrimination practiced within the structures of Sierra Leonean Anglicanism, and was transferred to Lagos to be pastor of the Breadfruit Church. Johnson later became the great defender of Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther, 1806 through 91, against his detractors in the controversy over the last years of Crowther's episcopacy on the Niger. Crowther is probably the most famous West African Christian of the 19th century. A Yoruba freed slave, he was one of the first graduates from the Fora Bay College. Ordained as an Anglican priest, he did missionary work back in his home area, as well as being involved in the ill-fated Niger expedition of 1841. In 1862, when he was looking forward to retirement, Henry Venn appealed to him to accept the call to become bishop on the Niger. Ostensibly a fulfillment of Venn's theories, in reality, it broke all Venn's own rules. Rather than a native bishop being the crown of a self-sustaining local church, Sierra Leone would have been the obvious choice, Crowther found himself in charge of an enormous area with inadequate resources and personnel, and almost completely devoid of local commitment in finance or personnel. It was, in fact, a missionary diocese. For the next 20 years, Crowther tried to build up the church with some success, but through the use of Creole pastors and evangelists rather than local people, and without being able to provide the training or the supervision which would have been necessary. Crowther lived hundreds of miles from the diocese in Lagos and did not have transport, and CMS, wedded to the fiction that this was a self-supporting native church, was slow in giving adequate financial assistance. A number of moral scandals and one widely reported murder case implicated church workers. The CMS missionaries who were introduced to the Niger from 1878 tended to blame Crowther's benevolent but indulgent leadership for these problems. Then, in 1889, a new group of young missionaries arrived under the leadership of Graham Wilmot Brooke, a man of independent means and no profession, who had been prepared for a military life. He was also a man of intense but unbalanced dynamism, impatient with all ecclesiastical and mission structures. The new group was influenced by the Keswick holiness teaching, which was such an important stream of English Protestant spirituality at this time. They were rigorous in their criticisms of the spiritual and moral laxity which they saw in the congregations and among the workers. In other circumstances, missionaries influenced by the Keswick movement were to do important and good work. For example, Pilkington in Uganda. But in this environment, their zeal overstepped the boundaries of prudence and good sense. Their moral absolutism, combined with the increasing racial stereotyping of the Creoles as being, in some sense, innately inferior to proper natives, the dregs of society, as one missionary outrageously put it. The young missionary's damning report on Crowther's nominal episcopate reinforced the mood in CMS circles that this experiment had been a failure and should not be repeated. To the great distress of the Christian community in Freetown and Lagos, when Crowther died, he was not replaced by an African. The furor which these events created gave new impetus to the growth of Ethiopian churches, that is, churches led by Africans independent of missionary control, usually retaining the liturgical and doctrinal standards of their church of origin, but determined to fulfill, in authentically African terms, the biblical prophecy that Ethiopia shall stretch forth his hand to God. Psalm 68:31. Already Mojola Agbebi had in 1888 established the Native Baptist Church. Others were to follow, though James Johnson resisted leaving the Anglican Church. In Hastings' words, more painfully than anyone else, Holy Johnson represents an Ethiopianism unable to repudiate its debt to European Christianity. Having refused to become what he scornfully called half-bishop, Johnson did at last become assistant bishop in the Niger Delta, part of Crowther's old diocese. But as West Africa fell under formal colonial rule in the 1890s, There was in both mission-founded and Ethiopian churches a strong undercurrent of African nationalist sentiment to inform the debate about colonialism. South Africa. The development of Christian mission in South Africa presents a number of comparisons and contrasts to the West African 19th century experience. One common theme in the development of an African church is the crucial role played in both areas by Western-educated Africans, people who were conscious of being children of two worlds, bilingual, both culturally and religiously. The main difference was the power of white settler Christianity in southern Africa and the much more substantial European missionary presence. Missionary families, especially in the second and third generations, often merged into white settler society and absorbed its values. The Boer farmers from Dutch, Huguenot, and German stock had by 1800 begun to identify themselves as African. Ik ben een Afrikaner was the famous boast of one Trek Boer. But this identification bore little resemblance to the Portuguese Zambezi experience of absorbing and internalizing the mentalities of the local cultures. The Afrikaner sense of being preserved as a people, volk, against the odds, which stems at least partly from the Dutch experience of forging their nationhood in opposition to the sea and the Spanish, was reinforced by that exodus from British rule in the 1830s known as the Great Trek. It was not, at least in this period, as is often suggested, an outworking of Orthodox Calvinism. Rather, one might call it a folk self-consciousness. In the 19th century, Scottish evangelicalism was deeply to inform the life of the Dutch Reformed Church through the introduction of Scottish dominees, or ministers, which also brought a more orthodox Reformed character to Afrikaner religion, as did the influence from Holland of Abraham Kuyper's neo-Calvinist theory at the end of the century. The colored community has also claims to be regarded as part of an Afrikaans culture, and many colored people belong to the Reformed Church by the latter part of the 19th century, organized in their own churches rather than as inferior members of the white congregation. Even the DRC, by the end of the 19th century, was beginning to become active in missionary work to black African peoples. Enthusiastic about mission at a safe distance north of the Limpopo, and even as far afield as Nigeria, but increasingly seeing mission also in terms of evangelizing the local South African peoples among whom they lived. White Afrikaner religion is important for a more general discussion of African Christianity, both because it reflected and helped shape the way the Afrikaners conceived themselves, and because this in turn had such fundamental import for the whole of South African life. The Christianity of the English-speaking portion of the white community diverged less from the British norm, though it is interesting that the famous quarrel between Bishop Robert Gray of Cape Town and his fellow Bishop of Natal, John Solenso, whom Gray accused of heresy, had important implications for the development of the Anglican Communion, being a major factor in the convening of the First Lambeth Conference in 1867. The first English-speaking missionaries in the Cape from 1799, especially the London Missionary Society, representing primarily a congregational tradition, were extremely critical of the social effects on both indigenous inhabitants and imported slaves of Cape Dutch society. Johannes van der Kemp, a Dutchman employed by LMS, and his successor, Dr. John Philip, a Scot, campaigned for the human dignity of the Khoikhoi, the original inhabitants of the Western Cape, and the growing mixed race or colored community. Often the best means of securing that dignity seemed to be to establish separate and economically independent communities, both at the Cape and in the hinterland, for example, Griqualand, where colored people trekked to escape Boer dominance. Afrikaners bitterly resented such missionary interference in the ordering of social and economic relations with native peoples. Taking their cue from the perceived missionary protection of colored communities, some African rulers, most notably Moshoeshoe of the Basotho people, regrouping in the aftermath of Shaka's disruptions, invited missionaries as a means of strengthening and preserving their own societies from threatened disintegration in the face of European expansion. Such rulers often became disillusioned as they realized that the missionaries themselves could become conduits of the very forces they were trying to avoid. Increasingly, this was not simply Afrikaner pastoralism, but British imperialism, and with the discovery of diamonds and gold, the intrusion of international capitalism and industrialization. Moreover, missionaries often seemed to have a negative attitude to a whole range of important elements in African social life: polygamy, lobola, bride price, levirate, marriage of widows to brothers-in-law, initiation ceremonies. The LMS missionary John Mackenzie talked enthusiastically of weakening the communistic relations of members of a tribe among one another and letting in the fresh, stimulating breath of healthy individualistic competition. The reality was that though African chiefs were often the patrons of mission, they rarely succeeded in directing and taking charge of the processes of change and transformation which missionary Christianity brought. Among the Xhosa, Christianity intruded at a time of severe disruption to society through a succession of wars with the settlers, British as well as Afrikaners, for the English had settled in the Port Elizabeth area from 1820. Mission stations often provided a refuge for those made landless by these wars, or those who for one reason or another wanted to escape their obligations to their chief. Such people were dubbed Amakoboka, those having a hole where to hide. Particularly receptive to the Christian message was a group which came to be known as Mfengu, whose core had originally fled as refugees from Shaka's wars, the Fikane, and were settled by the British as friendlies in Xhosa areas. Two Xhosa figures from the early 19th century have come to symbolize two contrasting ways of responding to Christianity and British power: Nexel and Nsikana. Nexel was a diviner who had had contact with Boer farmers and knew something of Christianity. In some ways, he was a man who could be regarded as an outsider in both his own Xhosa society and in the white settler community, a type of person often regarded as particularly susceptible to religious change. But his initially favorable impression of Christianity turned to contempt and opposition. He saw mission stations as instruments of colonial espionage, and came to the conclusion that missionary religion was alien to African spirituality. The correct way to worship God is not, he said, to sing mdi 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 all day and pray with their faces on the ground and their backs to the Almighty, but to dance and enjoy life and to make love, so that the black people would multiply and fill the earth. All this led him in 1819 to lead an attack by Xhosa warriors on the colonial frontier town of Grahamstown, advising his followers that the bullets would turn to water, a recurring theme in the African religious resistance to colonialism and informing such diverse movements as the Mahi Mahi resistance in German East Africa in 1905 and Alice Lakwina's Holy Spirit movement in Uganda in 1986. Captured and imprisoned on Robben Island, one of the first of an illustrious line of political prisoners, he was drowned trying to swim to freedom in 1820. Contrasted to Nexel is Nsikana, a respected establishment figure in Xhosa society, counselor to the Nkika chief. He advocated conciliation with white rule rather than feudal opposition, steeped in Xhosa spiritual values, including the spiritual value of cattle. One of his most famous dreams concerns his favorite ox. His thinking became increasingly influenced by Christian values. He composed praise songs and hymns to the Almighty, which were passed down and altered within the Christian community and became the core of Xhosa hymnody. He was never baptized, but wanted to be buried in the Christian manner. He was a profound influence on a whole generation of educated Christian Xhosa, who came into their own in the aftermath of the traumatic failure of the cattle-killing movement of 1857. This event was associated with the young girl Nankwawus, who prophesied that if Xhosa killed all their cows and stopped growing maize, there would be a general resurrection of the ancestors, a renewal of the earth, and a restoration of prosperity. Cattle were already threatened by an epidemic of lung sickness, but the overall result was quite the opposite of the prophecy. Famine, the collapse of organized resistance to British expansion, an exodus of Xhosa onto white farms, the crumbling of self-confidence by a whole culture. Your cattle are gone, my countrymen. Go rescue them. Leave the breechloader alone and turn to the pen. Take paper and ink, for that is your shield. Your rights are going, so pick up your pen. Load it with ink. Sit on a chair. Repair not to ho-ho, but fire with your pen. In the aftermath of this terrifying experience, Xhosa turned more than ever before to mission Christianity and to the school. Though this was by no means universal, there remains a profound cleavage in society between the Reds, traditionalist, and the school people. Missions, Methodist, Presbyterian, Anglican in particular, offered high schools, which, like their equivalents in Lagos and Freetown, provided a high standard of Western education. The most famous was the Scottish mission at Lovedale, established in 1841, in whose vicinity was erected Fort Hare College in 1916. For many years, Fort Hare was to offer degrees to Africans from all over the continent, until it was demoted to the status of a Xhosa tribal college, under the terms of the apartheid legislation of the 1950s. In the late 19th century, an impressive array of educated and articulate Christian Xhosa emerged. Tio Soga, married to Janet Burnside, a Scot, was a Presbyterian minister, hymn writer, the translator into Xhosa of Pilgrim's Progress. His son, John Henderson Soga, was the author of an important book, The Ama Xhosa, Life and Customs. John Knox Bakwa was a musician and hymn writer. John Tango Jabavu and Mfengu, a Wesleyan layman, was a journalist and politician. His son, D.D.T. Jabavu, was the first African lecturer at Fort Hare. Enoch Sentonga was the composer of Nkosi Sikalel e Africa, God Bless Africa, eventually to become South Africa's national anthem. It was from this group, combining with others from the Zulu, Sotho, and Tswana people, that the first leaders of the African Nationalist Congress of 1912 were recruited. As a group, they can be compared with the educated elite of Lagos, Freetown, and Monrovia. They have the same moral earnestness, pride of race, national consciousness. Perhaps more truly than the Creoles, they were bicultural, walking with ease in a Western and a local milieu. But there is a similar sense of alienation as well. One of the greatest representatives is Solomon Platje, a Tswana journalist, novelist, and Christian layman who was sent by the ANC to London to make representations to the British government against the 1913 Land Act, a measure which consolidated the racial division of the land, giving whites 92% and Africans 8%. He proceeded to write the great polemical work, Native Life in South Africa, with its haunting opening statement. Awaking on Friday morning, June 20th, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. In many ways, in people like Platje, the great campaigning humanitarian tradition of South African Christianity, begun a century earlier by Vanderkamp and Philip, was continued. Eastern Africa. In considering West and South Africa in the 19th century, it has been important from the beginning to appreciate the creative ways in which Africans responded to the Christian faith and made it their own. In Eastern Africa, by contrast, the figure of the missionary takes on a greater importance. The missionary as explorer, as visionary of radical social transformation, as strategist, concerned with a potential rather than an actual African Christian church. David Livingstone, 1813 through 73, traveled extensively through East Africa, publicizing the harrowing, disruptive effects of the growing slave trade in this area, blamed on the Arabs, though its roots at the end of the 19th century were connected with the growth of European plantation economies of the Indian Ocean. Livingstone can usefully be contrasted with his contemporary, Ludwig Krupf, a Württemberger Lutheran who worked for the CMS in Ethiopia, and from 1844 at Rabai near Mombasa. Livingstone, burnt with indignation at the suffering and oppression borne by Africans. Krupf's pietism led him to see Africans in terms of the fallenness which they share with all humanity. Both missionaries were failures if winning converts is the measure of success, but both inspired many missionaries in their wake. Livingstone was sure that an end to suffering would only come through the radical reordering of society. I go back to Africa to make an open path for commerce and Christianity. That might mean planting white settlers to pioneer a new agriculture. It certainly required a recording of world trading patterns. Krupf was skeptical of relying on any form of colonialism. Banish the thought that Europe must spread her protecting wing over Eastern Africa if missionary work is to prosper in that land of outer darkness. Europe would, no doubt, remove much that is mischievous and obstructive, but she would probably set in its place as many, but perhaps still greater, checks. In West and South Africa, Roman Catholic missions throughout much of the 19th century were at a disadvantage compared with the Protestant who tended to set the agenda. In East Africa, Catholics were able to take much more of a leading role. In 1838, the Lazarist priest Justin de Jacobus reestablished a Catholic presence in Ethiopia, to be followed by the opening up by Italian Capuchins under Guglielmo Massaja of work among the Oromo of southern Ethiopia. Daniel Comboni inspired new efforts to reestablish a Christian church in the Sudan. All three were to become bishops. Comboni was to create a new missionary order, the Verona Fathers. Another great administrator and mission strategist was Charles Lavigère, Archbishop of Algiers. He established the White Fathers, who were to have a profound impact on East Africa. Their name referred to the long flowing white cassock, the Muslim-style gandura, rather than to the racial composition of the order. In fact, Africans became members of the order, and the first modern Catholic bishop, Archbishop Kiwanuka from Uganda, was a white father. Lavigère created a strong, disciplined society, trained by Jesuits and inspired by Jesuit spirituality and pastoral theology. The White Fathers insisted on a thorough catechumenate for converts, inculcating the essentials of the faith. They stressed the importance of the mission as a self-supporting community adapted to the environment, and above all, the necessity of their members becoming conversant in the local language. The Holy Ghost Fathers, another French order, were the first to work on the East African coast. In 1863, they established a freed slave settlement at Bagamoyo. The Anglican CMS made a similar move at Freetown near Mombasa in 1873. Potentially, these settlements could have done for East Africa what Freetown did for the West African coast. But they came into being half a century later in very different circumstances. The European missionaries were more firmly in charge and were much more likely to see themselves as the initiator of missionary work, according much less autonomy for African Christians. Whether the Bombay Africans, freed slaves who had received an education in mission schools in India, or local people. The settlements were too restrictive socially and too narrowly based economically to sustain the kind of communities which had developed in West Africa, and which gave so much energy and drive to African-initiated missionary work. With the coming of colonial rule in the 1890s, the settlements rapidly disintegrated. The establishment of missions upcountry was to be under the direction of the European missionaries, rather than something which sprang primarily from the initiatives of East African Christians, though there were individual Africans of note who took part in the missionary expansion of the 1880s and 1890s, such as the Rev. William Jones, who accompanied Bishop Hannington on his fateful journey to Buganda, and James Mbotela, employed by the Africa Inland Mission as they began work in Ukambani. But even before these events of the early colonial period, there had been a remarkable development in the Great Lakes region. Buganda was a strongly centralized, sophisticated society, expansive and receptive to new ideas. Islam had gained a strong influence among the young pages, Bagalagala, who resided at court and were in training as the future leaders of the country. In 1875, Henry Morton Stanley visited Buganda. The Kabaka king, fearful of the political consequences of an over-reliance on Muslim outsiders, discussed the possibility of Christian missionaries coming to his country, and Stanley dispatched his famous letter to the Daily Telegraph, pleading for pious practical missionaries to come to Buganda. The Anglican CMS arrived in 1877 and the Catholic White Fathers in 1879, and were soon locked in bitter conflict with each other and with the Muslim faction. The vigor and enthusiasm of intellectual controversy stimulated rather than alienated the young Buganda elite, and very quickly each religion developed a substantial following. The Kabaka soon found that Christianity was likely to prove just as subversive as Islam. In attempting to clip its wings, first the Anglican bishop James Hannington was killed en route to Buganda, along with a substantial number of Africans, including Christians and Muslims from the coast. And then some 100 Christian converts, mainly from the ranks of the young pages, were burnt to death, many at the Namugongo execution site, which was later to become a shrine. The main result of this Holocaust was to convince the surviving adherents of the new religions that it was necessary to exercise power themselves. This gave rise to a coalition of Muslims, Catholics, and Protestants who overthrew the Kabaka and seized power in 1888. But the different factions were themselves soon involved in an internecine struggle, which was only finally resolved by the intrusion of an outside colonial force and the emergence of the Protestant faction as the political victors, but now under British overrule. There are many examples in the modern history of Christianity in Africa of rulers acting as patrons of Christian missions. But Buganda is remarkable in that a whole ruling class became Christianized, and within a remarkably short period of time, initiated a thoroughgoing Christianization of society. Islam survived as an important minority, but the Christian church, in both its Protestant and Catholic versions, became integral to Ganda society with a profound effect on the moral, intellectual, and cultural life both nationally and locally. The churches in Buganda became strong folk churches with deep roots in the villages and among the peasantry throughout the land. At around this time, in 1896, the Christian emperor Menelik of Ethiopia defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa, one of the few decisive defeats of a European power by an African nation in the era of the Scramble. It was an event of great significance for African Christians throughout the continent, reaffirming the sense of Christianity as an African faith, with roots in the biblical narrative itself. Ethiopia in the Bible signifies Black Africa as a whole, and reinforcing the sense that Africa figured in God's plan of salvation, even at this time of colonial intrusion, political, cultural, and religious. This strong, unified Ethiopian state enabled the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to overcome its institutional and theological divisions, to reclaim areas lost in the 16th century, and to engage in a mission work which involved both an extension of the Christian message and Amharic cultural imperialism. It was an expansion which has been compared to the work of Baganda Catholic and Anglican evangelists and sub-imperialists in extending the gospel, British rule, and Ganda cultural norms in many parts of Uganda in the early years of the 20th century. Colonial and missionary scrambles. Throughout much of the 19th century, missionaries were quite content to live as guests of African rulers. In certain circumstances, they did urge what was called a forward policy in terms of their home government's involvement in Africa. Governments tended to be suspicious of such entanglements. Lord Palmerston acidly remarked about the Zambezi expedition of 1858, "I am very unwilling to embark on new schemes of British possessions. Dr. Livingstone's information is valuable, but he must not be allowed to tempt us to form colonies only to be reached by forcing steamers up cataracts." Britain was reluctant to exchange its free trade policy for colonial entanglements, but as such adventures became more attractive for France, Germany, and King Leopold of the Belgians, each for their own nationalistic or geopolitical reasons. So Britain felt compelled to stake its prior claim to much of Africa. Between the Congress of Berlin of 1885 and the early years of the 20th century, most of Africa was partitioned against its will by European aggressors. The missions with long-standing interests in Africa were not at first the forefront in the demand for colonies, though their presence was often useful to colonial powers in claiming spheres of interest. By the 1880s, the planting of new national missions might well be encouraged by European countries anxious for their place in the sun. In the feverish atmosphere which increasingly took hold, missions might become militantly nationalistic, urging their sometimes reluctant home government to protect national interests in the area against foreign predators, or what they saw as increasing anarchy within Africa itself. For example, the Scots missions campaigned for Britain to assert its interest in what became Nyasaland before the Portuguese, with a much longer interest, roused themselves. The CMS campaigned vigorously for the British government to take over Uganda in the face of internal civil disorder and German expansionist desires. By and large, African Christian communities might be predisposed, if not to welcome, at least to accept European control and to collaborate with the occupying power. But equally, in areas of Islamic influence, European powers relied on Muslims to provide a core of literate clerks and functionaries for the new administrative apparatus. Societies which traditionally had been resistant to Christian mission, like Ijebu in the hinterland of Lagos, might well fiercely resist colonial intrusion. Ijebu provides an interesting case, in that the Ijebu, reacting to their violent death at the hands of an imperialist force, became one of the most receptive peoples in Nigeria to the new religions, both Christian and Muslim. Even where missionaries had welcomed and promoted the colonial takeover, this did not necessarily mean that they were uncritical of the results. Indeed, long-standing missions, conscious of their greater knowledge of the situation, were predisposed to outspoken criticism of the perceived shortcomings or injustices of colonial rule. Missionaries were at the forefront of disclosing the atrocities of the rubber plantation economy of the Congo Free State. They were critical of forced labor in various East African British colonies. They advanced themselves as spokespersons and defenders of native interests in settler-dominated colonies like Kenya or Rhodesia, with all the implications of paternalism which such a claim conveys. As profound as the colonial takeover was to be, for most Africans it was just one of a whole host of crises to convulse Africa at the end of the 19th century. Crises in the ecology, in medical pathology, in society, and the increasing incorporation of Africa into a global capitalist economy. Robin Horton, in a famous discussion, examined the attraction of both Islam and Christianity in this period in terms of the enlargement of scale, the increasing importance of finding intellectual and conceptual resources to cope with a macrocosm rather than simply a microcosm. Even where the colonial impact at first seemed remote and safe to ignore, except in superficial ways, the stance of certain predominantly pastoral peoples, the colonial takeover was, sooner or later, to impinge profoundly on all aspects of life, and to be the driving force in a conceptual revolution. Islam and Christianity seemed to offer resources to cope with these radical changes. In sub-Saharan Africa, Christianity, as the religion of the colonial powers, had a definite advantage. It, above all, was equated with the modern, and modernization was seen as essential for Africa. in material as well as intellectual and even spiritual terms. Christianity in colonial times, education and adaptation. For missionary Christianity, being a Christian and going to school were two aspects of the same process. Catechumens were called readers, precisely because they needed to learn basic literacy skills in order to cope with texts, whether biblical or catechetical. In the 19th century, missions had created boarding high schools, in British missions often attempting to replicate a public school ethos, with a grammar school, curriculum of classical languages, and with the European language as the medium of teaching. By the end of the century, there had developed a more modern curriculum, and there was the beginnings of an emphasis on vocational and technical skills. There was also the basic elementary catechetical teaching in the vernacular, and this sector everywhere expanded enormously under colonialism. What was the relationship between these elementary schools and the high school, which inevitably could only teach a privileged minority? Could the school in the bush serve as the basis for a colonial education system? These issues became particularly pertinent in the years after the end of the First World War, when colonial governments developed their own ideas of responsibility for the welfare of their subjects. Missions were anxious that governments would not try to create parallel secular systems in which the Christian ethos would be lost. Equally, governments were anxious to be seen to fulfill their new role, preferably as cheaply as possible. There was plenty of opportunity for partnership. In the early 1920s, an American charity founded the Phelps-Stokes Commission, which traveled extensively through tropical Africa, directed by the American educationalist Jesse Jones. The commission was heavily influenced by the kind of education developed in the southern states for African Americans, inspired by Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee Institute, offering an education which was adapted to the particular economic and social conditions of the community. That is, one which did not fundamentally call into question those conditions, even if they colluded with racial inequality and injustice. In the African context, the positive part of their message was that education should deal with the realities of African village life, rather than with an exotic curriculum which served only to alienate people further from their own culture. But this could easily be interpreted negatively as an attempt to introduce a separate and inferior type of education, designed to keep Africans from taking advantage of modern conditions. This was especially true in settler-dominated societies, where there was often a prejudice against educated mission products and a desire for what were seen as more practically orientated technical courses which fitted in to the requirements of the white economy. But whatever criticisms the educational philosophy of Phelps-Stokes would subsequently be subjected to, at the time, the commission fulfilled two very important purposes. First, it created a strong climate of opinion that the school in the bush should indeed be affirmed and its Christian character strengthened, but that it needed drastically to be improved educationally. This was best done by a contract between mission and government, the mission to supply suitably qualified teachers, and the government to refrain from creating a rival parallel village structure for education, but to support the missions with grants in aid and to develop curricula and an inspectorate. Second, the commission was important for African Christians, one of its members being Dr. James Aggrey, an educationalist of West African origin who made a great stir wherever he went. He was regarded as a magnificent role model, an example of how education might engender respect and equal status for the black person in a societies where black people were denied that dignity. Gray affirmed the importance of cooperation between black and white, using the metaphor of the black and white piano keys popularized by Booker T. Washington in the USA, and rather controversially as it seemed, to condone segregation. In Africa in the 1920s, Gray's words were invested with much more positive connotations, the possibilities of improvement and progress, and the affirmation of human dignity. Joe Oldham of the International Missionary Council, one of the forerunners of the World Council of Churches, was supremely active in the interwar years in setting up a system of mission-government cooperation. Some of the evangelical faith missions, for example the Africa Inland Mission, were rather suspicious of going along this road because they feared that the imposition of government curricula and general interference might well detract from the supreme evangelistic task of mission and encourage secularizing tendencies among their pupils. Increasingly, however, this was seen by African members of those missions as putting their communities at a severe disadvantage. They paid the taxes which government dispersed as educational grants to missions, but these grants were not coming back to their areas. These tensions were also reflected in Roman Catholic views of cooperation with government. This can be seen clearly in the differing views of Catholic missions on the Niger in West Africa. Carlo Zappa of the Society of African Missions at Lokoja, in rejecting the old, discredited style of mission concentrating on freed slaves living in isolated Christian villages, did not want to produce detribalized mission Christians, and was equally suspicious of Western education. I believe that in encouraging them to be instructed, we are pushing our young people towards the European business house and towards government employment. He refused to have secular schools at all in his mission area and concentrated on building up an efficient catechetical and seminary system. It paid dividends in that the first Igbo priest for Paul Emesit, ordained in 1920, came from the SMA area. In sharp contrast was Bishop Joseph Shanahan of the Holy Ghost Fathers, some way down the river. He was enthusiastic about cooperating with government. Those who hold the school hold the country, hold its religion, hold its future. This meant wholehearted cooperation with the Colonial Department of Education and acceptance of its secular curriculum and inspections. It too paid off. It has been estimated that 40% of schools in Igboland became Catholic, and Catholicism became the major denomination among the Igbo, despite the 30-year head start of the Protestants. Shanahan's enthusiasm was endorsed by Monsignor Arthur Hinsley, the special visitor apostolic to Catholic missions in British East Africa. Collaborate with all your power, and where it is impossible for you to carry on both the immediate task of evangelization and your educational work, neglect your churches in order to perfect your schools. If Zappa in Nigeria and the AIM in Kenya were seen as eccentric in holding out against secular education, Zappa's concern about not producing detribalized natives was echoed again and again in the interwar years. It has been powerfully argued that the idea of tribalism is less to do with the realities of Africa than with the European perception of Africans as living entrapped in small-scale, mutually exclusive units, locked in timeless tradition and with a single unchangeable identity. Colonial theories of indirect rule were often premised on this kind of reasoning. It was a powerful stimulus to interwar missionary thinking, the fostering of what were considered wholesome aspects of tribal life, rather than its wholesale destruction, the recognition of the organic nature of society. Working among the Chaga people of the Mount Kilimanjaro region of Tanganyika, the German Lutheran Bruno Gutmann argued that mission should aim at the Christianization of society as a whole, the creation of a Volkskirche, in which the primal ties of family, clan, and community were recognized and honored, an antidote to the individualism of the West. It has produced a strong, cohesive, self-confident Chaga Lutheranism. Too often, however, adaptation was a mere tinkering with what were regarded as traditional customs, a romantic conservatism which was resented by Africans who were more aware of the changing realities of life and the need for participation in the modern. On the other hand, ill-considered interference in custom by missionaries could have explosive repercussions, as happened in the female circumcision crisis, which erupted in Kenya in 1929. The attempt to compel Kikuyu Christians to pledge at their baptism or institution as church elders not to circumcise their daughters became the focal point of what was seen as a frontal attack on the integrity of Kikuyu culture. I am a Kikuyu and no water can wash away my Kikuyu nationality, wrote one protester. Had not Moses himself refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, but returned to his own people and threw in his lot with them. Missionaries have tried on many occasions to interfere with the tribal customs, and the question is asked whether, circumcision being the custom of the Kikuyu Christians, he is to be a heathen simply because he is a Kikuyu. One result of this hotly debated controversy was the formation of a number of independent churches and the breaking of the missionary monopoly control on how Kikuyu were to receive the gospel. In the final analysis, the issue was not about the preservation of tradition. The Kikuyu are often characterized as exceptionally progressive and adaptable, but about who is the arbiter of what is or is not acceptable for the Christian ordering of society, missionaries or African Christians. This ends part 2.